It's it's really lovely to see you all this evening. This is the first event I've done since the conference itself in October 2019. So it's a real joy and a pleasure to be sat in the same room as you all. And a big welcome, hello to anyone who's on the live stream. It's lovely to welcome you here as well. So, my name is Edwin Kumasaru. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Edinburgh University. And along with Tessa Dyshirt, it was a real privilege to co-edit this book, Imagining the Apocalypse, Art and the End Times, published open access with Courtauld Books Online. The book explores how visual culture has pictured Armageddon from the 18th century to the present, all across the globe. The end times sits at a kind of precise point where social worlds meet cultural imaginaries. And both artists and politicians have drawn on apocalyptic rhetoric for different ends. And sometimes those visions are in conflict with each other. And that's a kind of conflict that the book itself has explored. So briefly, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone who made this happen. Some of whom are here today. So it's the authors, some of whom are also in the audience, and the peer reviewers, and the Courtauld Books Online team have been really wonderful to work with. So this evening, my co-editor and I will speak for roughly 5 minutes each, and two of our authors will also give 5-minute presentations about their chapters in the book. And then afterwards, we're going to have a drinks reception in the Research Forum seminar room, which is just along the hallway. If you'd like to tweet about the event, the hashtag is Imagining the Apocalypse, or all one word. So I'll introduce Tess. She'll speak and introduce the others, and then we'll have a kind of roundtable discussion all together. So Theresa Dyshirt is a doctoral candidate at Heidelberg University. Her research studies contemporary art and ecology in Japan after the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster. So would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Eddie. I can just reiterate, Eddie, and say it's been an incredible pleasure to work on this project and a really good learning experience for us, especially working with so many brilliant scholars together on this book. And I think with an ongoing pandemic, it can sometimes seem like the times we live in are especially apocalyptic, also with war and inflation and climate change and whatnot. But I also think that visions of the apocalypse can be consolatory, and the extrapolation of imagined endings also brings with them possible new beginnings and can help us to cope with these present times. And in this sense, the book highlights how visions of the end times have been part of the human imaginary across a wide range of geographies and time periods. And with our presentations today, we would like to give you a taste of the contents of the book and show how art and visual culture have evoked apocalypse across multiple scales, from personal to social to political, national to global, secular to religious, ecological to cultural. And I would like to encourage you all to make your own connections and share them with us in the discussion. And now I'm going to introduce you to our speakers and then hand it over to Kate for the first presentation. So Lucy Byford is a doctoral candidate at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on print culture and performance of Berlin Dada. And Kate Pickering is an artist, writer, and doctoral candidate at Goldsmiths and her experimental writing and performances explore notions of embodiment, belief, and sacred space through research in American megachurch evangelicalism. I knew I would pronounce this wrong. So, Kate, if you would like to start.
Thank you. My research examines questions of body, belief, and sight through an exploration of the North American evangelical megachurch, specifically Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas. Up to 52,000 people attend Lakewood on a weekly basis, and millions more access the services via TV broadcast and online from around the world. Evangelicalism is the dominant form of religious expression in the United States, with estimates ranging between 25 and 37% of the population identifying as evangelical or born-again Christians. As a result, evangelicals form a significant voting bloc and wield considerable political and sociocultural power. I consider what Lakewood's story is and how that story is communicated via a range of visual and material forms: architecture, stage and interior design, projected imagery on giant high-definition screens, music lyrics, performance, and preaching. I propose that the story is a fundamentally orienting construction, one that provides a sense of stability and belonging in disorienting times. The Osteen family, who lead the church, are part of the Word of Faith movement, also known as the Prosperity Gospel. They tell a therapeutic story, one that encourages believers to claim the well-being, success, and wealth that God has promised, mirroring a wider cultural shift which emphasises the self and positive thinking. The story is also a teleological one. It foregrounds a linear ascension to victory, not only in believers' lifetimes, but in a glorious future to come. As believers' gaze is directed to the heavens, away from a troubling earth, to watchfully wait for the return of Christ at the end of time. Intensified by the visual spectacle of the scale of the crowd, lighting effects and imagery on screen, in tandem with evocative lyrics and charismatic preaching, the story creates intense embodied feeling. This is experienced as an atmosphere, a climate of belief. The meteorological climate, storms, floods, and unstable ground, are repeatedly used metaphorically to image God, the abiding rock, and by extension the church, as a site of refuge and rescue. I consider what is at stake when believing bodies experience both real and imagined weathers, what implications this climate of belief might have. Houston is a city situated on what is essentially a swamp on the Gulf Coast, a location threatened by flooding, subsidence, drought, and extreme weather events, posing an ever greater threat and literally destabilising the ground beneath believers' feet. I place this within the wider context of eschatology, an obsession with end-times theology within the evangelical movement, creating an ambivalent attitude toward climate crisis. Lakewood's recent message series on signs of the end times replicates the idea that Christ's return is imminent, hurricanes and floods are to be expected, and believers' focus must be on salvation alone. As an artist and writer, I work from the disidentity of being a former evangelical. I draw on both site visits and my involvement in evangelicalism to write, alongside my cultural analysis of the church, an experimental text titled "There is a Miracle in Your Mouth." This multi-layered text draws 3 sites into relationship, all of which have approximately the same square footage. My writing room, the bronze rotating sculpture of the globe at Lakewood, which is pictured here behind the preacher, and acts as a microcosmic metaphor for the wider site, and the cell of medieval anchorite, mystic, and first woman to be published in the English language, St. Julian of Norwich. In the text, I identify with the church, I voice the body building of liquid, which thinks and dreams, moving from rigidity to flux. It slowly becomes aware that a hurricane is bearing down upon it, bringing with it the contamination of the outside through a catastrophic flood. This is not, however, a destructive, apocalyptic ending, but a reimagining of what the site, freed from binaries of inside, outside, believer, non-believer, sacred, profane, might be. Hand over to Lucy.
Okay. So my chapter explores the contemporary Japanese director Sono Shion's 2015 science fiction film, The Whispering Star. And with the film, Sono responded to the Fukushima nuclear disaster of March 2011 and its aftermath. And even though more than a decade has passed since the disaster, the exclusion zone still exists and the nuclear disaster is ongoing. Despite these conditions and due to reconstruction policies that the Japanese government pushed, especially in lead up to the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, most of the disaster-affected area has returned to apparent normalcy. However, in the immediate aftermath, the Fukushima nuclear disaster and its exclusion zone seemed to foreshadow a post-apocalyptic vision of the future. The radioactively contaminated no-go area resembled like a real-life dystopia defined by a highly toxic ecology and devoid of people. It thus appeared to lend itself to the apocalyptic imaginary. Among the many artistic responses to the disaster, The Whispering Star stands out for its use of science fiction to contend with the socio-political and ecological conditions of post-9/11 Japan. In reference to literary studies scholar Frederick Jameson, I argue in the chapter that the future visions of science fiction narratives can function to defamiliarize and restructure our experience of the present. As science fiction, The Whispering Star thus serves to open up avenues for criticality from which to reflect contemporary post-disaster Japan. The film takes us to an undefined time in the future, and humanity has been reduced to only a handful. They are silently fading away on the eve of their extinction, brought on by human failure and the irredeemable repetition of man-made disasters. The story follows a female android named Suzuki Yoko, who works for an intergalactic delivery service. As she travels from planet to planet on her spaceship through the universe, her only company is her childish board computer 67Mine. Yoko's task is to deliver parcels that contain ominous and seemingly worthless objects to the last remaining humans. Rather than fabricating the landscapes of these planets, the film uniquely utilized the real, seemingly post-apocalyptic landscapes in and around the Fukushima ghost towns of Namie, Futaba, and Okuma as backdrop to Yoko's voyages. The planet's last human residents are also not played by professional actors, but by real disaster evacuees. The film is an adaptation and realization of a script that Sono wrote in 1991. In the chapter, I trace the film's origins from the 1990s to its realization in 2015. I examine how The Whispering Star superimposes two cataclysmic events of Japanese society: the burst of the bubble economy in the early 1990s and the triple disaster of March 2011 and its aftermath. In drawing a connection between these events, the film highlights the conditions of its apocalypse as accumulative, drawn out, and without hope for renewal. And this is what Jameson identified as the conditions of postmodernism. In focusing on the film's post-apocalyptic representation of human disillusionment with science and technology, a loss of linear time, and a denial of life in the present for memory, as well as an exploration of what it means to be human, I argue that the film contains an implicit warning. The Whispering Star portrays the future as defined by apathy, boredom, and stasis, and as an anachronistic assemblage of nostalgic memories of the past. It therefore warns of the consequences of a postmodernist neoliberal political system that prefers the status quo over real political and social improvements. I contend that the film also cautions against succumbing to a post-disaster reality that has been shaped by governmental cover-ups, voluntary amnesia of the disaster and its victims, and attempts to limit the freedom of expression of media and cultural outlets. And lastly, I would like to briefly address some recently published allegations against Sono. At the beginning of this month, several Japanese actresses came forward and accused him of sexual harassment. And I just want to say that I absolutely condemn this behavior. But for me, this has brought up the question of how such knowledge reshapes my perception of his work, and if it's possible or even acceptable to consider the art as separate from the artist. I don't have a straightforward answer, but maybe that is something we can return to in the discussion. And now I hand over to Lucy.
Okay, thank you very much, Teresa. I'm sure you can all hear me. Yes, cool, great. So my chapter looks specifically at an intervention carried out by Berlin Dadaist Johannes Baader, and his adopted alias is the Oberdada, or the Supreme Dada. And in July 1919, Baader briefly interrupted a parliamentary session. So at the time, these were held at the National Theatre in Weimar. So this is due to revolutionary unrest in Berlin. And during this intervention, he made a short speech, kind of addressed to one of the MPs, and distributed the series of Dada flyers from one of the viewing galleries. So from this gallery balcony, Baader flung out multiple copies of 2 different Dada texts, and he'd managed to smuggle these into the National Assembly past the high security setting of the theatre, which was guarded by Freikorps and lots of police at the time. So a few months before, the Freikorps had, aided the government in shooting lots of communists in the street. So Baader is there, and he's slipped past these guards with his Dada texts in hand. And so the first the first text, he's got these 2 texts with different allusions to the apocalypse. And the first one is this grey card promoting his so-called Handbook of Oberdadaism, abbreviated to HADO. And this card describes the HADO project as a book of the Last Judgment, so a kind of doomsday book. And his second Dada text, titled The Green Corps Special Issue, in the text he portrays himself as, quote, President of the Globe, who sits in the saddle of the white horse of Dada. So this idea that this white horse refers at least partly to the first horseman of the apocalypse is heavily implied by another accolade which Baader adopted for himself, and which was also taken up by his Dadaist peers. So this is the arbiter of the Last Judgment. So in order to fully unpack these allusions towards this kind of like idiosyncratic personal apocalypse, I kind of approached this project firstly by reconstructing the intervention as far as was possible. So this was generally quite an important exercise because this is a really significant intervention in terms of the history of Berlin Dada. So it's kind of often upheld as sort of primary evidence for the Dadaist radical avant-garde credentials. Yet I found in my research that the way that the event has been canonized in the literature substantially differs from the way the events unfolded themselves and were reported in the press. So it's definitely worth kind of revisiting that and taking time to accurately reconstruct the setting of the theatre as far as possible. So as part of this reconstruction, it was really important to think about how the Berlin Dadaists and Expressionist circles which they emerged from understood apocalypse as inextricably bound up with the First World War and the resulting revolutionary period and regime change. So in Baader's case, he most explicitly associated the apocalypse with the revolution through his HADO piece, his handbook. As this doomsday book, now lost, consisted of, it was like this really chunky book, consisted of a kind of ongoing run of clippings from newspaper headlines from a sort of all of the different newspapers of different political spectrums, that he then collected during the revolutionary period and put together in this kind of ersatz scripture, this sort of mega montage. And he also, so in addition to this, another instance where we see revolution and apocalypse meeting in Dada's work is in his parodic account of his own intervention after the assembly interruption, which he published in the magazine Dada, issue 2. And in his kind of retelling of his own action, he paints a picture of himself as both this kind of holy, omnipotent figure, but also an architect in the post-war peace negotiations happening during this revolutionary time. So I think he really capitalizes on the high drama of the Book of Revelation in these various intertextual elements. I think the reason that he's doing this is to kind of critique the German avant-garde's wider use of apocalypticism at the time. So it's very bombastic, but I think in a very kind of self-reflected and self-critical way at the same time. So this manifested in the expressionist belief that the war would ultimately provide a form of salvation, marking a sort of turning point for mankind and birthing what they referred to as a new man. So very redemptive ideas, which, and this kind of discourse is what Dada, I think, is lampooning in this intervention, because as far as the Dadaists were concerned, this revolution had fundamentally failed, and the fact that Dada was interrupting a national assembly of representative electors as opposed to a workers' council was kind of living evidence of that failure. So no death of the old world order had occurred through this apocalypse of the First World War. And we were kind of invited to talk about what personally drew us to each of our topics. And I think for me, just the very radical nature of the intervention, it's very under-discussed in the literature, and I don't understand why, because, you know, it's the Parliament, they're discussing the Constitution, and it just seems like a point of absolute high drama in Dada historiography. And I'm really interested in protest and direct action, and the overlaps between these two forms of protest and avant-garde performance, and how these two, they both seem to defy easy categorization, I think. And I'm interested in the tension that they seem to generate between artistic autonomy and then political aims of a protest. So, yeah.
Thank you. Those were all fantastic presentations. Really lovely to hear you talk about the work again. So before we open up to a roundtable discussion, I'm just going to say a few words about the book's larger themes and set up some talking points for our conversation afterwards as a panel, drawing on some of the material we've already, or some of the themes in the material we've already discussed. Before I do, I just want to say, as I'm sure you can tell by now, I forgot to say this at the beginning, but sadly Bob Mills can't join us because he tested positive for COVID this morning. He did say that he was happy for me to let you know, but that's why he's not here with us this evening. But like all of the other chapters, you can read his contribution online. So it's a real pleasure to be here this evening with you to celebrate the launch of this book. A book which began its life in a conference held in this very room roughly 2.5 years ago. Is the original programme. The conference was held just weeks before the Chinese government reported its first ever case of COVID-19. And at that time, we gathered in this lecture theatre to discuss the many complex ways in which artists and politicians had imagined worlds ending, with, of course, little idea that a world-changing pandemic had already begun, or at least had already begun to be set into motion. This book was written, peer-reviewed and edited during that pandemic. And we're immensely grateful to all of those people who contributed to or supported the project, for creating time and space to think critically and deeply about Armageddon in the midst of a global crisis, one crisis among many. I found my co-editor and our authors to be extremely generous with their ideas, their analysis, their time and their care. As someone who can sometimes catastrophize myself, I learned ways of situating catastrophism within certain cultural and historical frameworks, thinking with and against its very logics. While the concept of worlds ending can be found all over the globe in different times and places, apocalypticism as a specific cultural discourse can be traced back to three religions in the ancient Middle East: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Or even further back to older Persian and Near Eastern mythologies. In this conceptual lineage, there's always been an association with violence or conflict. Indeed, the end times are often invoked with a militaristic framework, as their very structure is organized around narratives that usually depict a supposed out-group attacking an in-group. A struggle which is often cast as existential, and calls are made often for the elimination of that out-group. While this may be a common feature of Armageddon imagery, it's also important to acknowledge that as an imaginative body of thought, apocalypticism has always contained a series of contradictions, beginnings and endings, annihilation and revelation, with both the capacity for utopic and dystopic potential. Whether used in an exclusively positive or negative sense, every image of the end times contains the possibility for its opposite. And because of the very tensions in the idea itself, if the end times are often seen as a struggle for supremacy out of those two groups, encoded into them is also the image of their inverse, the suggestion that it could be otherwise. Apocalypticism also has very complex relationships with understandings of time too, which is something I suppose as art historians it's been interesting to think with. The end of the world often implies a linear narrative series of events, a before, during, and after an ending. But if prophecies of Armageddon are to be believed, it does not function in the way that we usually conceptualize the future as something that is full of possibility. Rather, it is guaranteed to happen. It's already been foretold. And in a sense, it has already happened. And as art and ideas come into contact with apocalypticism, time itself seems to split and fracture. And you often see this in a apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic literature, for example, or artworks. It's as though in these moments the past and the future bleed into one another. As such, catastrophic and totalizing world ending begins to disrupt and distort even the linear framework that underpins Western ideas of time. Because I suppose that's the other thing, is that if Armageddon represents an end to everything, it also entails an end to time itself. Here we come to another tension that also runs through apocalypticism as a cultural discourse. The connections and complications between the imaginative and the material. Racists who warn of a white genocide may be projecting, but indigenous experiences of ongoing settler colonialism have quite literally been world-ending for hundreds of years. In the book's chapters, the symbolic and the real collide in complex ways. Our introduction considers Victorian artist John Martin's 1822 painting, The Destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, a 19th century British portrayal of the eruption of Italy's Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. The object not only fed a spectacular imagination of disaster, its very surface was almost totally obliterated and canvas torn in London's catastrophic 1928 flood. The artwork was subsequently placed in storage and forgotten about, assumed destroyed, until it was rediscovered in the 1970s and then restored in 2011 for an exhibition called John Martin Apocalypse, held at the very site that it had been damaged decades earlier. Restoration and rebirth are, of course, also apocalyptic tropes. But debate raged at the time it was restored as to whether the act of God, as one critic called it, collapsed the symbolic and the material in the image, with the latter almost totally erasing the former. If the end of the world implies an end to imagination itself, the book considers what it might mean for artists to grapple with such a tension, and indeed us too, as our historians, in a warming planet full of imperial violence, attacks on LGBTQ people, accompanied by the threat of nuclear destruction and global pandemics. What might art reveal to us in moments such as these? So I think we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have an audience questions from you. So please begin preparing your questions. Something I'd love to ask, actually, just hearing all of your presentations just now, is about masculinity. And obviously they all register in different complex ways. But apocalypticism, I mean, particularly, for example, in Christianity, because of the association with Christ, it often has links to savior figures or prophets. Is there any way that came up in your material?
Well, in The Whispering Star, it presents a dystopia, so there are no real male savior figures or heroes or anything. The main character is the android, and she presents sort of like a motherly figure. She engages in a lot of domestic activities. She's diligent, gentle, calm. So she's kind of the antithesis to this very masculine savior. But in this dystopian vision, men are portrayed as like childish. For instance, her board computer has a child's voice, and he counts the insects in the ceiling lamp that are trapped and thinks that they are planets. Or the other only male figure in the film is a jester who is sort of going mad. So in this very dystopia and these antithesis of the male hero, that's how masculinity is portrayed.
Do you think your artist is kind of performing a parody of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of the literary expressionists, this idea that I was talking about the new man, it was the kind of toxic masculinity of its own day. In some ways, it was very much a response to this idea of the new woman. This was seen as very threatening, and I think Dada here is kind of by constructing this identity of sort of absolute supreme power, which is very much based on Nietzsche's own kind of grotesque sort of parodies of similar power structures. He's definitely trying to challenge this, and his wife was also a feminist activist at the time, so it's kind of, I'm sure he was aware of that struggles.
What's the church like in terms of gender politics?
So it's not that there aren't prominent female figures within evangelicalism. There are. So Paula White Kane was Trump's spiritual advisor, for example. There's figures like Joyce Meyer who have a huge influence, but it's still predominantly white male figures within evangelicalism, and the tendency. So you tend to find white evangelicals also being overwhelmingly Republican. So 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in the 2016 election, and previous to that, find white evangelicals supporting Bush. So there is this kind of white male figure that you see. So within Lakewood, the church that I study, it's a family legacy church, so it's handed down from father to son. So it was founded by John Osteen, it's now led by Joel Osteen, and I think it will very likely get passed on to his son Jonathan, who's now preaching at the church. But within the top sort of 50 megachurches in America in terms of size, I think there's one female leader. So it's very much a kind of male scene. And Trump is a really interesting figure in terms of white evangelicalism's support of him, in this kind of contradictory, sort of holds himself up as supporting the evangelical community, but then sort of his behaviour seems very much at odds with Christian morality. But they kind of frame him as a figure who's going to deliver America into a more kind of Christian nation, despite his shortcomings.
Something I'd also love to ask all of you, I appreciate it's a slightly big question, but how's this project changed how you think about the world in which we inhabit?
Do you mean the project of the
the apocalypse? Oh, yeah.
I'm going to have to think about that.
That's right.
Pass over to
Take,
somebody else.
I mean...
You're looking at me. I think it's certainly made me just a lot more sensitive and aware to how relative and easily manipulated apocalypse is as a concept, just in all of these different contexts. So I think, just even looking at it in the press, public discourse, discourse within activist circles as well, and like decolonizing the idea of apocalypticism, I think is really important. So I think it certainly has.
I think it kind of made me realize that every time has its apocalypse, that there's not just one apocalypse, but it's a reoccurring thing, and then kind of every generation thinks that they have some kind of apocalypse that they have to go through. because our book covers such a wide range of topics and themes are occurring over centuries, basically, ecological apocalypse in the 18th century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century. So yeah.
I think for me, it's easy to see evangelical apocalypticism as this kind of extreme, kind of very different way of thinking and being that seems very other to how we including everyone along with me in that. But actually, the fear and kind of threat we feel in terms of facing climate crisis is not a dissimilar experience to the experience of white American evangelicals who feel immensely under threat. They feel that their identity is being threatened, the very core of who they are. So their identity is very much grounded in the idea of America as a Christian nation, and secularization and pluralism and I guess the disintegration of the kind of things that they hold dear. All that feels like a huge threat. And I suppose my approach to the subject matter that I deal with is one where I don't want to relativise, because I'm talking about two different sort of situations and sort of belief systems, but to kind of build a bridge perhaps so that we recognise that if we were, it's easy to understand how they might feel that sense of threat and how they might want to protect that. So I guess it's a sense of kind of feeling that that position is somehow understandable, even if it's not something that we've experienced.
This came up when you were speaking, but in fact, perhaps your presentation as well. How did you feel, how did you work with a discourse that itself was so riven with contradictions? And what was it like dealing with a subject that has its own inbuilt tensions, I suppose?
It's really complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult to navigate because, I mean, it's easy to put your own kind of ideas and frames upon something you're researching, but of course it always slips away. You know, however you want to kind of simplify it to make it communicable and to try and it's never boxed in. So you know, it's very easy to think of evangelicalism, for example, as kind of a homogenous group. It's not homogenous at all. It's a very diverse group. Yes, it's complicated. But I suppose you kind of, you take the kind of material that you've got and, I guess hone in to make it worthwhile. I don't know if that's a helpful answer.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I think in the case of like Dada, and he it's really interesting because he was a big critic of the Christian church, and yet he really kind of exploits and capitalizes and almost fixates on this sort of biblical references to the book of Revelation. So in many ways, I think, that provides this sort of stability or framework. So it's all hanging off this really established, almost like monumental, just sort of very set and familiar understanding or framing of the apocalypse. And so from there, he kind of uses that as a springboard and saying, okay, well, now that we are sort of alienated from and divorced from this, the institutionalized church as we know it, as we should be, that kind of opens up these old narratives of apocalypse to kind of rewrite them and mine them for just for new meanings and like quite personal idiosyncratic meanings. So I think with my particular thing, it was project, it was quite easy because I was just, reverting back to this quite familiar story in the Bible.
You were asking about tensions.
Yeah, well, inbuilt, a discourse that can contain its own opposites is a kind of writing challenge.
I don't know if there's inbuilt the tension that I see with my material is not in the discourse, but in the exclusion zone itself, kind of, because different sort of realities exist about the exclusion zone. There's this perception from the outside that it's some kind of post-apocalyptic landscape, and like especially non-Japanese artists have been dealing with the exclusion zone through science fiction or through a post-apocalyptic lens, but then when you go there, it's very normal. It's full of people that work there, full of construction workers, decontamination work going on, and it's very not apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic at all. And then at the same time you have this other layer added through what the Japanese government has been proliferating about the exclusion zone as this like gleeful reconstruction that is going on, and which is also not the reality. So you have these different realities about the place that kind of are in tension with each other, and that also come out in the movie a little bit. Yeah, that's the tensions that I see.
You've kind of answered this already, but I'd love to ask the two of you, as you raised that as a point, how you felt the symbolic and the material sat with each other. Because obviously in the exclusion zone is quite literally a toxic landscape, as well as a filmic representation of an imaginary scenario. But you have the the performance in the Parliament, and obviously there's Houston has its own kind of climactic, consequences of climate change. How do the imaginative and the material rub up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of Dada's ways of reapproaching spirituality, sort of, he eschews institutionalized religion, but he's a big monist. So monism was a kind of spiritualist philosophy. It was sort of rebuttal to Cartesian dualism, and he describes it as a sort of metaphysical chemistry. So it's this, monists believed that there was no separation between the material and the physical. So it's something that he's constantly thinking about, and it actually leads him to quite almost science fiction-esque ways of thinking about the world. And he references, in addition to kind of political events and sort of religious parody, he'll also talk about he'll throw in lots of cosmic language as well. I think the setting of the theatre is obviously really significant, but also the specific timing of the action. I kind of look at the reports of the action, because he released these pamphlets just as this particular amendment was being passed, which was to do with censorship. So it reminded me of, Kate, what you were talking about with the timing is very like slick production, and how you've got the lights and the music, everything is, very much this kind of total artwork, as it were.
That's funny, I've just been writing about the total artwork.
Oh, really?
So there's a total artwork.
Really, yeah.
So what you find, I mean, megachurch architecture differs widely, but at Lakewood, because it's a box, it's basically a converted basketball stadium with no windows. They basically brought the outside in through a kind of mimicry. So you get the giant high definition screens, they'll show footage of like white clouds scudding over a blue sky, or like mountain ranges or redwood forests. There's like extraordinarily kind of complex lighting systems, so that when worship services are in are happening. There's kind of light shows going on, smoke machines. The lyrics all point to the natural world, but in a way where God is always foregrounded as the stability amongst a kind of unstable natural background. So song lyrics point to God as a rock and to the storms of life, or to the church as a kind of ship or ark or a lifeboat, and to believers kind of finding rescue or victory or stability through sort of clinging or cleaving to God and to the church. So there's a kind of complex interplay between the kind of material and visual culture that's propagated in the church. It's kind of telling this story about if you're in the church, you're safe. So the recent series that Lisa Osteen-Combs just did on the Signs of the End Times at Lakewood, so she's the sister of the main pastor, she was basically saying, like, come on, get in the ark and you'll be safe. Like, this is God's place of safety, just stay in the ark. But then you get events like Hurricane Harvey happening, and reportedly the church was breached by flooding. So there's a kind of contradiction between real life events and the imaginaries that circulate within that space. So yeah, I mean, I would say the imaginary is one of kind of being oriented upwards, so there's constant emphasis on like looking up to the heavens, looking up to God, and away from kind of earthly realities. So talking about complexity and tensions within the church, that presents a problem. I realised one thing I didn't say earlier in your question about sort of masculine figures in the church. What I should have said was that evangelicalism supported Trump because they saw him as a figure who was going to bring about Jesus' return on earth. The reason being because there's a prophecy in the Bible about King Cyrus and God using him to bring about God's will, and there'd been this prophecy about Trump. But it's all, without going into lots of detail, it's all kind of tied up with the biblical book of Revelations and how the end times are going to come about, and how that involves Jerusalem and Trump's foreign policy in Israel, which I'm not going to get into in detail. You can read the chapter. But that is why I kind of pointed out Trump as this kind of a masculine figure who seems like he could be kind of key in bringing about the kind of end times that evangelicals believe is going to occur.
I have one last question I'd love to ask. I'm slightly conscious of the time. Does anyone else have anything they'd like?
Sorry, I wanted to say thank you. That was very interesting. And I have a question that's sort of based on something Teresa said and something Eddie said, and this idea of the end. Because you sort of said that in Fukushima, things are sort of going on as normal. And I was thinking about the pandemic becoming endemic and what we do when, it's not a question of the end or even of the past collapse onto the future, but of an intolerable present, apocalypse. I mean, I imagine the colonialism chapters grapple with that a bit, but I wondered if you had thoughts on that, or if you came across it in your research, or if it was something you're thinking about as one of the temporalities of the apocalypse.
That's a brilliant question. Would you like to? I suppose the question I was going to ask was about time and temporality. So maybe that's something, if you want to chip in afterwards. And I guess, like, inbuilt into the cultural discourse of apocalypticism are like all of these complex tensions about temporality itself. So there are many different experiences of time simultaneously at play. Both the suggestion of like the possibility of things ending and there being a like limit point, but also it's almost as though around apocalypticism as a concept, time itself begins to collapse and linearity ceases to work in the same way. And I guess probably all of us in this room experienced time in very particular ways during the pandemic, and it being disrupted, or its patterns being thrown off. And I suppose there's something interesting in your question about like being able to draw lines and boundaries, whether something really has ended, or does it just perpetually continue? And in a way, like whether it's climate change or like you said, settler colonialism, these things have immensely long durations. We're talking hundreds of years. So there are particular moments of crisis that might feel especially violent, but they're also like unfolding with a slow time as well. And I guess those are the two different speeds that we experience and we live through. And they are, in a way, they are kind of irreconcilable, in the same way that the fact that the apocalypse itself both represents an end and a beginning, or like that it contains so many opposites, they are irreconcilable in a conceptual discourse. And so something like Fukushima can be both, there can be the event itself with the nuclear meltdown, the contamination of the landscape, can sit alongside this like perpetual everyday life where things just continue as well. And I guess that's part of the kind of rich contradictions that map it. But thank you for it. Do any of you want to say anything about time and how it came up in your chapters?
Well, the interesting thing about time in the movie is that the future is depicted like sort of like a pastiche of the past. So the future isn't really the future, but it's sort of a regression to different pasts that are superimposed onto each other. So Sono uses like a Showa era, which was post Second World War until 1989 set for his films, but then it's also anachronistic, like some of the aspects aren't out of that time, so it's like a memory, the past superimposed onto each other. And it kind of goes with what you said, that it's collapsed, so there's no progression anymore in the future. It kind of just goes back, and people that live in this sort of universe, they don't really live, they are kind of depicted as ghost-like, so they inhabit sort of a liminal space between life and death, and they're sort of trapped. And with that, he kind of wanted to resemble the victims of the nuclear disaster, who are sort of trapped in this non-time, because the future that they could have had is finished, and there's no way for them to get out of it, because they're in this perpetual ghost-like state.
And yeah, I think with Dada, well, I mentioned that the handbook, his kind of doomsday book, and this sort of compression of revolutionary time that he created through this sort of ream of headlines. So that's him, I think, kind of expressing distortions of time. But he also faked his own death, and then set up this new calendar based on his resurrection, which he followed for the rest of his life. So again, like really trying to write into his own sort of faux narratives, the sense of time breaking. And because I think with the war, because it was such a traumatic event, there was this desire for, surely there must be some break in time, and I think the discourse of the apocalypse goes alongside that. But what I think the Dadaists were kind of, a lot of their art was responding to was the just frustration and grief about how absurd it was that so many things continued the same. So they had the same civil service, the same judiciary, lots of the same representatives of different areas. So it's again that kind of banality of the apocalypse, and life somehow managing to continue, not the same but remarkably similar as before.
I guess in terms of time and American evangelicalism, for them the apocalypse is a shift in paradigm. So it's not there's not a finality to it, because actually the story of Revelations is there's like a continual unfolding of one thing after another, and ultimately the hope is that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and actually those are kind of utopian. There's like a utopian promise at the end of the kind of this period of tribulation and war and kind of destruction. So there's also an ongoingness in it as well. And I mean, I guess the other thing also is that with religious apocalypses is that they're always being predicted and then passing their prediction point. So even in Revelations, at the start of Revelations, it says this is going to happen soon. And you find evangelical preachers always saying this is going to happen soon, or it's coming, and you need to be ready. So there's kind of an urgency, a feeling that you're always on the cusp, but then there's all this kind of ongoingness as well. But I think that urgency and that being on the cusp then dictates how people live and behave and understand their place in the world. So it sort of has a huge kind of material impact. Going back to the kind of material and the imaginary, it definitely works its way out into kind of material reality.
It's a great question. Do we have any others? Would anyone else like to? Yeah?
Just thinking about, kind of related to the time question, thinking about place, like utopia could mean like good place, utopos, or it could mean utopia, like no place, and how maybe, like, was there a sense in your kind of research where place also, or space, kind of collapsed in itself as well? I don't know if that relates more to something than others.
That's a fantastic question. Who wants to?
I feel like it's relevant to all of us, I think, but just one example that kind of came to mind in Dada's kind of account of his action. He rewrites the space of this theatre. So instead of the kind of reality, which is, him as this sort of eccentric at the margins, who basically the politicians ignored him, more or less. There was this sort of brief kerfuffle, and then the proceedings went on as usual. But he in the retelling of his action, he becomes this high priest preaching to his congregation. So he's rewritten himself out of the margins and into the centre, and in fact, like the sort of high point of power. Which is, that's just something that came to mind. It's like the malleability of space in as well as time in these apocalyptic narratives.
I mean, like I said in my presentation, the film uses the real landscape of Fukushima and presents it as these other planets, this future dystopia. And the film is entirely shot in monochrome colors, so it does serve to kind of distance you and defamiliarize you from these landscapes that have become, I think, beyond Japan, very well known through media images of the disaster and ships perched on land and destructed houses, but still they feel foreign because they're presented in this different way. But then in the movie there's one scene where the landscape turns polychrome for a couple of seconds, and so suddenly it becomes very real, and you kind of get taken back to this place, and you see it as the real Fukushima landscape, and then it turns monochrome again and you're distanced again. So that's a very interesting contradiction about the reality of the landscape or the place, and then it being this future dystopia.
So I was thinking that there's kind of two sites, I suppose, and one is in the life or body or experience of the believer. So there's a kind of constant emphasis on believers' hopes and dreams being realised in the here and now. So I'm talking specifically within Lakewood, but you get this kind of culture within prosperity gospel and kind of charismatic or Pentecostal type congregations generally as well. So the idea that you're constantly, like, there's a constant sense of God's blessing is on its way. If it's not materialised yet, it's coming. So there's a kind of utopian drive in the here and now. But then also, I suppose the other side for that, the side of the believer's body or life or experience is the New Jerusalem. So the idea that there will be a new earth, and that it's described in Revelation as like a city with gold and like made of precious stones with a river running through it and a tree of life, and there's no more crying and no more pain, and God is reigning with his people. So this is the kind of the final sort of the sort of vision at the end of the apocalypse, I guess.
That seems like a good note to leave it on. Thank you so much for coming here this evening. It's been really lovely to have shared this space with you. Please join us for drinks in the Research Forum seminar room, and it would be lovely to chat to you further about the end of the world. Thanks.